This figures here are basically show you that in 2004, we saw a skyrocket in levels of EU immigration, following, as we know, the decision to open Britain to immigration from accession countries in Eastern Europe. And most of the other countries that could have been destination countries chose not to do this for 5 years. We also saw other immigration rates going up too, from the Commonwealth, say. However, by the time of getting on to 2015, they had dropped. And they had dropped because David Cameron promised to reduce immigration, but the only immigration he could reduce was immigration from the Commonwealth. He had no real influence over EU immigration. So he basically dug a little hole for himself there. Now, why does this matter? Well, I don't normally show coefficients in presentations of this sort because Anand really doesn't like me to. However, I think this one's a great little set of correlations. What we see here is levels of change in immigration. We saw how it was rising generally. The amount of column inches dedicated to immigration by a couple of the national newspapers, and actual immigration levels. And well, the first thing we see is the Daily Mail has a correlation of 1, a perfect connection with public concern about immigration. So the amount of column inches in the Daily Mail over a period of about 10 years is correlated pretty much exactly with the level of public concern of immigration. Now, you could argue this is the Daily Mail, and we all know they have certain agendas, but actually the Daily Mail itself is if you look at the Daily Mail, it's correlated 0.9 with actual immigration levels. So the Mail, in particular, and other papers we've looked at, is a conveyor belt for information about what's happening at immigration. And we had a question earlier about levels of immigration in particular areas. That is more a national level issue. It's an issue that people care about because they see the figures going up in unprecedented ways for Britain, and the conveyor belt for that is the newspapers. And they're not distorting the truth. They're actually reasonably accurately picturing it, the Mail in particular. Now, what happens as a result of this? Now, this is a graph here which shows you the strength of the association between people's concern about immigration and their dislike of the European Union over roughly the same time period, running from about 2004 through till just before the last election. And what it shows you is that as years go by, concern about immigration is more and more strongly linked with dislike of the European Union. And we know that as years go by, the proportion of the immigrants coming into the country are those from Eastern Europe, rather than from, say, the Commonwealth or elsewhere, because of the 2004 decision. So as the proportion of East European immigrants grows, as immigration goes up, public concern about the EU rises in line with it. And this set the situation, first for the 2015 election, where what we saw is that when you ask people who can actually deal with immigration, and don't forget, something like 80% of the population think there's too much immigration. It's not just Leave voters. It's actually a lot of people with degrees, whatever. It's that the concern about immigration is spread beyond certain groups. It's actually quite high level. In fact, it's always been reasonably high level, to be honest. But what we see here is, on the left, people's views on who will try and reduce immigration, and on the right, people's views on who will actually achieve a reduction in immigration. So 40% of the population, when we asked them, this is a YouGov survey of 30,000 people, said, yeah, the Tories might try and reduce it. 20% at that point then said, yeah, they'll succeed in reducing it. UKIP, they were the only party that people, A, would actually want to really reduce immigration, and B, would probably succeed. And obviously that's because UKIP stands for leaving the European Union, which is the main problem for immigration rates, not having that control. This is the setting for the 2015 election. That's what we led up to. Now, David Cameron won that election. And as you see, Labour are seen as basically not that bothered about controlling immigration and not likely to change it much. What happened? Well, we had Brexit. We had the referendum, and when we had a decision by the Conservatives to seize hold of Brexit. The well-known, this is just a few, obvious quotes, basically, there are incentives for the Conservatives to seize hold of Brexit. They can kill off UKIP, who threatened them in certain areas. By then, UKIP were getting 13% of popular support. No real seats, but nonetheless, they were stealing Conservative votes and potentially threatening Conservative constituency majorities. They've also got the possibility of penetrating Labour heartlands, where places like Stoke-on-Trent or whatever, where there are a lot of anti-European voters, traditionally Labour, but now potentially up for grabs because reasonable level of UKIP support. So if the Conservatives can seize Brexit effectively after the referendum, and then they can probably do rather well. Especially as, don't forget, at this point, Jeremy Corbyn was seen to be a massive liability for Labour. It was only once the campaign started that that changed quite dramatically. At this point, they were working on the assumption that UKIP were a chaotic mess post-Brexit, and Labour were led by somebody who's deeply unpopular. Now, there was a risk you might lose some of the educated, affluent constituencies. But given that the Liberal Democrats had just, to some degree, shot themselves heavily in the foot by joining with the Conservatives and fallen through the floor in terms of public opinion and seats, and given that Labour were led by Jeremy Corbyn, they probably thought these risks weren't too bad. So we then saw, if I can get this to go, what we know from Mrs May when she won, the Brexit means Brexit ad infinitum, but then refined, made more precise. Brexit will involve controlling immigration, our own laws, and an overt rejection of Norway or Switzerland models. Brexit meant hard Brexit. That was what the Conservatives decided to push for. And the logic of doing that was to steal all those UKIP voters and wavering Labour voters in the Midlands and the North. Not so much in the major cities, but certainly in the smaller towns and the small cities. So we know, as a result of this strategy, in the 2017 election, just looking at constituencies, that the Conservative support increased by about 10 points in constituencies where more than 60% of the population voted Leave. These are figures actually gathered by Chris Hanratty of Royal Holloway, and are quite well known. Where it was less than 45%, their support dropped. Labour were less influenced by this. They had a 9% increase in Leave seats and a 12% in Remain. And Ed will probably talk more about that, because for Labour it was less the issue. But for the Conservatives, this looks like they won. They got what they wanted. So how did they get there? Did they get there by looking really, really good on Brexit and very clearly opposed to the European Union? Or was it a Brexit election? Sort of, yes. But if you look here from the British Election Study, at measures of where people perceived the parties to stand in 2017 and 2015, you see the following. So on the left, you've got redistribution. So a high score means you're very opposed to redistribution, classic Tory position, as it were. The low score means you're supporting of redistribution. It's the classic Labour position. And on the right, we've got want to get together. At the bottom is want to join as closely as possible with the EU, and at the top is want to be as far away from the EU and have as much independence from the EU as possible. So what changed? Well, actually, not an enormous amount. Between 2015 and 2017, people perceived Labour to shift slightly to the left, and Tories didn't really change, which is interesting, given that Corbyn was in control, and an interesting topic in and of itself. Mrs May, of course, did run on what the Spectator described as the most left-wing Conservative manifesto for 40 years, so she was interested in squeezing the gap between herself and Corbyn on that, and if the fact that it didn't work very well is probably more to do with campaign and events there than the actual policies. So that was fairly stable. And it's not clear if things like free university fees are really that left-wing. They're not very redistributive, are they? They're actually giving money to the middle classes. So again, it's not massive changes. If we look at this side, the European Union, well, people do perceive the Tories to have shifted towards a more Eurosceptic position. You know, it's a rise of about 1 point on a 10-point scale, which is reasonable, but not massive. They've also saw Labour, funnily enough, doing slightly the same thing too. And this is, obviously we've had an intervening referendum, and now we're asking people how they feel about this issue. And so, yeah, it's a small move. But what really changes between 2015 and 2017 is this. Who's going to deal with immigration? The thing that drove Brexit in the first place is the thing that then drove Brexit's impact on the 2017 election. So what you see here is a measure. We follow these things through the British election panel studies over time, and we can see that prior to the actual 2016, the seventh wave, that dotted line in the middle is the actual referendum. And so what you've got there, let's look at Labour. So will Labour do anything about immigration? No change at all in that. Through Brexit, did have no consequence whatsoever. Will UKIP do anything about immigration? Well, yeah, they probably would do, although by now UKIP was obviously losing its raison d'etre and falling apart. But no real change up. And then the Conservative Party. And there is a dramatic change onwards and upwards. So they're now seen as liable as UKIP to stop immigration or reduce it. And of course, and are in a position to do so, given that they are the government. That's what changed. And the government were trawling for kippers. The government knew that UKIPers were up for grabs. And those UKIPers who saw the Tories as being likely to stop immigration or reduce immigration left. This is just UKIP voters in 2015. So over 80% of them who thought the Tories would do something about immigration left and went to the Tories. Those who didn't think that the Tories would do anything about immigration, far more likely, but even quite a few of those went to the Tories. Let's not forget that UKIP actually didn't run as many candidates in 2017. Big drop-off on the number of candidates, and it wasn't random, it was strategic. And of course, they were also no longer led by Nigel Farage, who was cutting important for their appeal prior to the time. And we'd had the referendum. So there you see it. Immigration stripped UKIP. Immigration became the key difference before and after the referendum. And by immigration, I mean the Conservatives' ability to deal with it. How did that change British politics? Well, first answer is this. What I call here the iron triangle looks at how values, beliefs about immigration, and beliefs about the European Union link together. Now, these correlations, again, these are not like the ones you saw earlier, which are more aggregate-level changes. These are individual-level data, tens of thousands of voters, and they're phenomenally high. You can ask the same question at 2 points in a survey, and you get the correlation of about 0.6. These correlations here between anti-immigration beliefs, anti-EU beliefs, and authoritarianism, or what I call social conservatism. I think use of authoritarianism, although very popular in academia, is probably not fair, to be honest. And I prefer to use the term social conservatism, and I do that in our book. These things are incredibly linked. So basically, clearly, anti-immigration views are linked to anti-EU views very powerfully. But they're also linked very powerfully with authoritarianism. These things lock together. What doesn't connect with your views on immigration and the EU is your views on the economy and redistribution. This is about sets of values to do with traditional values, to do about children being obedient, it's to do with stiffer sentences for criminals, it's to do with a desire for the death penalty. These are the sorts of questions that people agree with who are socially conservative, and people who disagree with that, socially liberal. And that's the dimension of politics that really swung the referendum, but also, as increasingly, as a result of the Conservative policy since 2016, changed the nature of our politics. Now, these little thin lines here, which probably need to be beefed up for a presentation like this, tell us something very dramatic. For decades, since the British election study started, we've shown, John and I were doing this back in the 80s and 90s together, working in the British election study as well, that this line up here, which is about whether you're left or right-wing values, is what really predicts your vote for the Labour or Conservative parties. These parties now get more votes, of course, than they have done since 1970. They dominate the electoral turn, 81% or so, 82% of the vote. Since time began, It's always been about redistribution and inequality. And now, no longer is the case. Because what you see here is a really dramatic increase in this social conservatism dimension. These concerns about traditional values versus other more liberal views are as powerful, people's votes, as inequality and the economy. And that is a dramatic and unique change which has never happened, as far as I know, at any point in an election that we've studied before. And that is a direct result of Brexit and the way the government reacted to Brexit. So, and now to Ed.
You'll probably already be familiar with the fact or the figures that show that Conservatives got a majority of the Remain vote, whereas Labour got a decent majority of the... the other way around. Conservatives got a majority of the Leave vote, while Labour got a majority of the Remain vote. But that also meant that the parties were dominated by their respective sides. 71% of Conservative voters had voted to remain in the EU, and 68% of Labour voters had voted to remain in the EU. This is also reflected in the attitudes of voters from either party. So this slide shows, along the horizontal axis, people's, whether they're pro-European or anti-European. And all you're seeing is people with Eurosceptic views became much more likely to vote Conservative, and people with pro-European views became much more likely to vote Labour. And the changes amongst the minor parties just really kind of mirror that change. So now I'm going to describe this in terms of vote switching between the elections. In these charts that look like this, the size of the bars reflects the party that the group was supporting at the outset, so in this case in 2015. The colours within the bars just show which way they voted in 2017. So what we see is that amongst Leave voters, the Conservatives were already by far the preferred party of Conservatives. And those voters were very loyal to the Conservatives in 2017, so the blue bar remains big within this. But they also picked up huge numbers of Leave voters from UKIP and a fair chunk from Labour. Labour, in the meantime, were losing Leave voters, particularly to the Conservatives, but they were also picking up a few, so it was kind of balancing out. Now, the picture on the Remain side is a little bit more complicated. What you see is that Labour were by far the most popular party in 2015, and they held on to a fair proportion of their votes. They also recruited a fair proportion of new voters from the Greens and from the Liberal Democrats, and also directly from the Conservatives. So the net result of these flows was that particularly the Conservatives become much more Leave-dominated, and Labour becomes much more Remain-dominated. Now, if we look at the timing of when this happens, it gives us a clue about the impact of the referendum. The Conservatives, this chart shows Leave voters dashed and Remain voters in solid. So the Conservatives, this point here is, the red arrow here is where the referendum was. So you see a big leap in Leave voting amongst the Conservative voting amongst Leavers right after the referendum and onwards. There's just a slight dip when you get to the campaign. For Labour, it's a little bit more complicated. You see an increase in their support just amongst Remainers after the election of 2015, but that fell away after the referendum. But it also fell away amongst Leavers. So there was a general increase after Jeremy Corbyn took over in support amongst Remainers, but then both sides deserted Labour after the referendum, only to return during the campaign. And the picture for the Liberal Democrats, there was a bit of a bounce after the referendum amongst Remainers, but it fell away again at the election. And we know pretty much what happened with UKIP. Fairly obvious. They lost what was their base, which was Leavers. That suggests two key periods. The first being before the campaign began, the second being campaign up to the election. So we're going to split the charts I showed earlier into those two periods. And what we see is during the period between the election and the start of the campaign, you see this pattern of switching, which is heavily dominated by EU voting preferences. So what we see is that during this period, Labour hung on to Remain voters reasonably well. They lost a fair few to the Liberal Democrats, but they're also picking up a few. The Conservatives lost a chunk of Remain voters during this period, including to Don't Know or Undecided, which is the grey. And if you look at the Leave voters, Conservatives, you see the same patterns we saw overall, which is high levels of loyalty, high levels of recruitment from UKIP, and some recruitment from Labour. The period up until the start of the campaign looks pretty much like the overall pattern, pretty much dominated by Brexit. What happens during the campaign period is that we see a general rise in Labour voting. So we see Labour hanging on to their Remain vote. We see them gaining more Remainers from the Liberal Democrats, from the undecided. Labour did very well amongst the undecided. They won over more than half the undecided voters during the campaign period, compared to something like 22% that were gained by the Conservatives during the campaign. So Labour were gaining lots of new Remain voters, but you can see they also gained Leavers. They gained Leavers who had previously been undecided, so these are people coming back to Labour. They even gained some Leavers from UKIP, and they gained a small number from the Conservatives. So this was a general rise in Labour support, slightly more Remain-oriented than Leave, but it was a general rise. The Conservatives, on the other hand, lost more Remainers to Labour and the Liberal Democrats than they were picking up from Don't Knows and from the Lib Dems. But they really hung on to their Leave voters and even gained a few. So during the campaign, it was really a story of Labour success, a campaign where Corbyn's ratings rocketed, where he started out very low compared to Theresa May and ended up at the same level as Theresa May. So the general election in 2017 can be thought of in terms of a game of two halves, really, in more ways than one. One in terms of it was a divide between the Leave voters on one side and the Remain voters on the other, but it was also a first half which was dominated by Brexit, followed by a second half which was the campaign, which was dominated by the leadership and the relative success of the two campaigns. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Leicester, as you know, as a whole, is a very diverse city, but my constituency is a predominantly white and white working class constituency. Whilst Leicester as a whole narrowly voted Remain by about 2,000 votes, my constituency voted Leave slightly more than the national average. I was lucky enough to be Labour's EU champion during the referendum campaign in the East Midlands. Another one of my massively successful elections. I mean, nowhere else voted Remain in the whole of the East Midlands. It was grim. It was the toughest election I have ever been involved with. Far tougher, actually, than 2010 with the whole election expenses scandal and the financial crisis. It was visceral. Without doubt, immigration was a huge issue. But underlying this was a deep-rooted anger that in parts of the country, people were not seeing any benefits of, the economy coming back since the financial crisis, that they weren't seeing their wages keep up with prices, that they weren't seeing any of those opportunities. And I'll come back to this, but I think one of the great tragedies since the referendum result is how little we have focused on fundamentally rewiring and reforming the economy so it works for places outside of London and the South East. London and the South East are the only places whose economic output has gone back to pre-financial crisis levels. And that, I think, those divisions are the root causes of many of the issues that we're seeing coming forward in the referendum campaign. In the last election, I very much agree. It felt like a campaign in two parts, maybe three. certainly at the beginning, Brexit was an important issue. Not the only issue, but an important issue. And the question was, who would provide strong leadership to negotiate a good deal for Britain? And without all my graphs and, facts, I distinctly remember, as you do, knocking on people's doors, somebody who had been absolutely for Remain just felt Theresa May would be stronger to deal with this massive problem. But then that all changed. And I think she didn't look strong. She looked frightened. She didn't want to talk to the public and hid away, whereas Jeremy Corbyn was out and about and talking to people and looked and felt more confident. There was another thing with the manifestos. I absolutely felt on the door or on the phone, people, especially older people, were deeply worried about the proposals in the Conservative manifesto. School cuts, NHS services, those issues all came up. So it was Brexit sort of became less of an important issue for some people, although I certainly benefited from Lib Dem and Greens swinging to me in Leicester West. There was a leadership question, and I had many Labour voters didn't make their minds up right till the last minute. They were worried about where we were, but then when they saw the alternative in Theresa May, they decided they have to come out to vote. But what I think is very clear now, it wasn't so much so immediately after the referendum result, where many traditional Labour voters constituencies voted to leave. Actually, we know from both 2015 and 2017 that a clear majority of those who voted Labour in both of those elections had backed Remain. And even if you exclude the sort of Remain strongholds of London and Scotland, a majority of people who voted Labour had actually backed Remain in the referendum. I think that sort of myth that, I'm not saying, by the way, that some Labour voters didn't vote Leave, because they did, but the majority of Labour voters had backed Remain. I think the country is still appallingly, terribly, worryingly divided. Both between Leave and Remain. Britain Thinks has a nice way of talking about it, the kind of diehards for Leave and the devastated pessimists who voted Remain are becoming more entrenched. There is a group in the middle that Britain Thinks called the sort of cautious optimists, although some of them are getting worried that it's more complicated than we thought. And the accepting pragmatists, many of whom I know are my friends outside of politics who voted Remain, but think we're just going to have to get on with the job. But those divisions are there. And I think the challenge now for us is exactly the same as it was after the referendum, which is to attempt to bring the country together. After that referendum result, the Prime Minister should have said, I hear the vote and the result for the people who want to leave. But I also understand that 48% of this country voted to remain. I will be open and honest about the different options, the pros and cons of each, to try and help bring us together and get the best deal. Now, that sort of pragmatic, consensual approach to politics, I know isn't terribly fashionable at the moment, but I think it's what the country needs. And we have to lead public opinion, not just follow it. And I think the country's crying out for leadership on this, the biggest issue we've faced for a generation. And this honesty about the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches is really important. excuse me for making a very party political point at the moment, but when the government says, oh, we can't publish any of these analyses because it will undermine Britain's negotiating position, I mean, it's deluded to think that the EU doesn't know what the advantages and disadvantages of the different approaches are. And actually, that's not what it's about. It's because I think Theresa May has wrongly decided to get entirely in bed with the Brextremists rather than being prime ministerial and trying to bring the country together, because it is a choice. We have different choices as a country, not just for the Conservatives, but the Labour Party too. It is right that we have said it's not really a transition period, it's an extension period, that we should remain in the single market and customs union. And we should say that is our ultimate goal too, because it is the only way we deliver a jobs-first Brexit. We cannot be an anti-austerity party that wants to leave the single market and the customs union. So it is crunch time for the leaders of both parties. And I actually think what is interesting is that there is growing support within Parliament for the EEA model, a Norway model, where we are in the single market plus a customs union. I think there would be broad support for that within Parliament, and if we have the guts to lead the debate within the country, we can make the case that it is good for jobs, our businesses and growth. It does give us greater controls over immigration, such as the use of emergency brake. It won't be popular with the hardline Brextremists, or those of you, many of whom will be in this room, are passionate about us remaining in, but I think it is a way forward. Rightly, our leadership believes in party democracy, and I would just say it's very interesting to me that 2/3 of Labour Party members want us to stay in the single market and customs union, and a half want the public to have a final say on the deal. And a further third are more in favour of that than not. So I think that is a very important point to emphasise. My final point here is back to what I said at the beginning, which is dealing with those underlying causes of people's anger and frustration about problems with the way the economy was working, which existed before the crash. Wages were stalling before the crash. The long-rooted, deep-seated problems that we have outside of London and the South East, that the economies aren't growing so fast, with standards in education, with the lack of training and investment in infrastructure. Dealing with the two together will help our country succeed and bring the country together, and I think that's the leadership Britain leads now.